Fair warning, I do not have the new Sony ZV-E1 camera. I don't have footage from it. The camera is not out to the general public. There are some vloggers who have millions of subscribers who have the camera and have previewed it. I don't have one, but I wanted to give some thoughts about what I've read about the camera if you are potentially interested in buying it. So again, don't have one. If that turns you off, you can stop the video now. But I do have some thoughts as someone who has purchased a lot of Sony cameras over the last 2 or 3 years, and I wanted to share that with you. Let's get started. Let me hit the headline right out of the gate. If the Sony ZV-E1 was available 2 years ago, that probably would have been the camera that I bought. They made that camera exactly for someone like me. I film almost exclusively by myself. I do not have the time to understand all the different camera settings, and Sony's making cameras that are geared towards self shooters. And this is definitely the apex of that, at least as far as it goes in April of 2023. Why is this camera the apex? Number one, it has an additional CPU processor that focuses on AI functionality. And that additional processor will allow subjects in frame. The camera will actually follow you and keep you constantly centered in the shot. That is amazing. So if you are filming yourself and you move around a little bit like I'm doing right now, this camera will follow you and it will keep the shot clean. The other thing that it has built in, there is a enhanced digital stabilization. There's like 3 tiers of digital stabilization in this camera. So if you are walking around with the camera in your hand, which I do all of the time, it is going to stabilize that shot where it almost looks like it's on a gimbal. And let's talk about gimbals for a second. Gimbals are awesome, but they are a total pain in the butt to use. You're constantly having to balance the gimbal depending on the lens, and if the lens has a moving element, you have to rebalance it. It takes up space in your camera bag. Again, right now, I'm inside my house. I'm filming on a standard tripod. I don't need a gimbal, right? I don't need a gimbal for this shot. And this is where I do 80% of my filming when I'm talking to you guys, right? I am on a stable shot. But when I'm outside, and you can go back and look at all of my videos in this channel when I'm on my man trips and on vacation, I do not have a steady hand. I don't. I'm the first one to admit that. Things like gimbals are very interesting to me. I've made videos before that I had this little tiny DJI Osmo Pocket that had like a built-in mechanical gimbal and this little teeny tiny camera. And I love that thing because, again, my hand is shaky. I don't have a steady shot, and that thing made my stuff look much better in that regard. Obviously, the video quality, the audio quality wasn't great, but I used that thing for years. It's dying, but I still kind of use it from time to time because it's so portable. The fact that Sony has a full-framed sensor with that level of stabilization to give something even remotely comparable to a gimbal shot is amazing. And I wish that my cameras had that technology, and I would buy it just for that. This is the ZV-1. This has a built-in lens, and they are following this template. The ZV-E1 is bigger than this. It's similar to size to the Sony A7C, which I also own. But it is a compact camera. It saves space because it doesn't have an EVF. It doesn't have an eye hole, right? So if you're looking at, if you like to frame up your shots, these cameras are built for people who do video and people who rely on the screens. They save space because they're cutting out the photography-centric elements of the camera. The sensor that is in that camera is the same sensor that is in the Sony FX3, which is a cinema camera, a full-frame cinema camera, and the Sony, I want to say like the A7S3, and the A7S3 and the Sony FX3 are basically the same camera. It might be the 4. I may have to correct myself. But they're basically the same camera. They're made for cinema, or the FX3 is really made for cinema and for filming. And, you know, most of the top tier vloggers of the last 2 years are using that camera or one of those 2 cameras. And now there's another iteration of the camera that's smaller, that's cheaper, and it has AI technology in it that actually has enhancements over the more expensive options. This sounds like a dream. What's the drawback? Overheating. Right now, this camera, from all of the reviewers, this thing has a tendency of overheating. It probably is because the camera body is smaller. It's using the same battery as all of the modern Sony cameras, including the A7 IV, which I'm using right now. It's like the MP100. And because of the overheating issue right now, this camera, or I should say the Sony ZV-E1, does not currently film in 120 frames per second in 4K. That functionality has not been turned on. Because the brains of the camera is based on the Sony FX3, there's no reason why the camera can't do it, except for the heating issue. So they're promising that this camera is going to come out with a firmware update sometime in June and July, maybe later, where they are going to turn on that functionality. This is where I will weigh in and provide some advice. I would not buy the camera if 120 frames at 4K is something that is incredibly important to you until they release the firmware and we see what it can do. If this isn't something that you care about, I don't particularly care about that. I'm not doing like the fancy 120 frame 4K shots. But if that's something that you care about, and I get why you would, if you're like doing like cool photography and you're like pouring like coffee into a cup and like it's all slow and cool looking and then you pour the milk in, I get it. I would still buy that camera for all of the other reasons that I mentioned. Again, if I had not already invested in 4 of these other cameras, that would be the camera that I would buy. Portability, film focus, video focus, that's where I'm at in my life. I have this, I've had this A7 IV for a year. I don't think I've taken one picture on the A7 IV. I've only done video on it. So I'm a video first person, and it's smaller, it's compact, it has a great sensor. Because of the sensor, this 12 megapixel sensor that it has, the A7 IV and the A7C that I have suffer from, like, if you shift the camera sideways, again, if it's not on a tripod and you're moving around, it's got this like jelly roll problem it's something to do with the sensor. The FX3 doesn't have that problem. This camera will also not have that problem. So if you're someone that is filming while moving, there are advantages to using that camera. And that would be part of my kit. I would definitely use that camera in my travel kit where I currently have the A7C. That's exactly the sweet spot that I would have for that camera. Again, because of the stabilization, I would use that camera for anything where I'm traveling and where I'm moving because it takes up less space. It is designed for someone who is physically moving. I don't have to pack a gimbal because that thing takes up a ton of room. It's checking a lot of the boxes. Sony hasn't been great about firmware updates that add functionality, and a lot of the customers of Sony cameras, especially the expensive ones, are very upset that some of the lower tier cameras like this A7 IV are getting more functionality than their flagship, the Sony Alpha 1. There are things that this camera can do that camera can't, and that's the $6,000 or $7,000 camera. And it's the same thing with some of the other more expensive cameras that they've released. These newer cameras have better functionality. They have things that people have been looking for, like if you use a Sony lens, sometimes there are certain lenses that do focus breathing issues. There's focus breathing compensation on the A7 IV. It's going to also be built into the ZV-E1, but some of the really expensive cameras don't have that, and a lot of people are frustrated with that. So my point is, if you are waiting for them to bake in functionality after you buy the camera, don't do that. If you can't live with the camera the way it exists when you get it in your hand and when you buy it that first day, don't buy it then. Wait until they actually come out with it. And again, if those firmware updates actually work, because again, that heating issue, that is a physical problem. I think that they can solve it with software, and they likely will, but you are dealing with a physical problem with heat dissipation, and there's only so much you can do when the camera's that small. And there's an extra CPU in it too. Don't forget that. There's an extra CPU in that handles all these new AI capabilities, all this movement and tracking information. So it's going to drain more power, it's going to heat up more, and that's why they didn't roll out that functionality when the camera is initially released, which I think it's going to be available in a couple of weeks, if not a couple of months. So I'll put the date here. So again, this is a bit of a niche audience, and I don't know if people who buy cameras and watch these videos are going to want to hear this from me. But in general, I would say that, again, if I didn't have this other investment in these other cameras, that would be the camera that I would go for. I would go for it For all the reasons that I mentioned, it's small, it's got the functionality, it's focused on the things that I do. This is what I do with the cameras. And they basically made a camera specifically designed for somebody like me. So if any of that sounds like it resonates with you, that would be the one. Let's see how they solve this overheating issue. But I'm curious about the camera. I think that if I ever replaced my travel kit, my A7C, even if it's in a year or so, that would probably be the camera that I would gravitate towards, because that camera seems like it's designed for people who are physically taking the camera and moving around with it. And that's exactly what I want. And I don't want to have to use a gimbal. I hope this was enlightening, helpful to anyone that may watch this video. Leave some comments if you agree or don't agree. And we can all have a conversation about this cool camera together. So again, thank you for watching, and I'll be back with another video in 2 weeks. Party on.